Hello, time for a Man in Gray book review. Today's book has a very long subtitle, so I'll see if I can get through it without messing up. The book is called The United States of Epic Fails: 52 Crazy Stories and Blunders Through History That You Didn't Get Taught in School. And the author is Bill O'Neill. This was published in 2022 by Lack Publishing. It's 172 pages. As the subtitle indicates, this is a collection of short essays, most of them are only 2 pages long, about famous dumb decisions made throughout American history. And some of them are well known, some less well known, including lawn darts, the Exxon Valdez shipwreck, which spilled oil all over the Alaska coast, the Enron bankruptcy, which triggered a recession in the United States, the Mars Observer disaster, which was caused by a mix-up between metric system and the imperial system of measurements, the TV show Turn On, which was so bad that it was actually canceled in the middle of its first episode and never aired on the West Coast, and Evel Knievel's ill-fated jump across the Snake River Canyon, which permanently damaged his reputation. One thing these little essays don't really dwell much on is why otherwise smart people made such dumb decisions. So I'm going to give you an example. I'm going to talk about 7 of these little essays in here and give you my opinion on why these were epic fails, why smart people did these dumb things. This book is, of course, a humor book primarily. Most of these stories are lighthearted. Some of them are really tragic, though, and we'll talk about one of those. Most of them didn't have long-term consequences, but some of them certainly did. And one of the mistakes that did have long-term consequences was the Watergate scandal. In 1972, Richard Nixon was running for re-election as president, and he was way ahead in the polls, and it was obvious that he was going to win. And he did win in a landslide. But Nixon had a paranoid personality, and his paranoia spread to his entire staff. And so, either at Nixon's direction or on their own, a number of his staff members hired some bumbling, incompetent burglars to break into the Democratic National Headquarters in a building called Watergate. Their plan was to install wiretaps on the phones and microphones in the various offices so they could listen in and try to figure out what the Democrats were going to do in the fall campaign. Well, the burglars got caught. Nixon freaked out when he heard about the burglars being arrested, so he hatched an elaborate plan to cover up the break-in and try to keep the White House insulated from what happened. Well, eventually, of course, the cover-up was exposed. Nixon was shown to be lying about the whole thing for months, and the scandal forced Nixon to resign from office, the only president in history who resigned. And in the following election, the Democrats won the White House and took control of Congress, so it turned out to be a huge disaster. And it was completely unnecessary because Nixon was going to win, and it was clear that he was going to win. But his arrogance and his paranoia forced him to try to rig the election to make absolutely sure he could win. Another less dramatic example of a epic fail was the USFL, the United States Football League. In the 1980s, a group of wealthy businessmen, including Donald Trump, thought it would be a great idea to form a new professional football league to compete with the NFL. They called it the USFL, and they spent large amounts of money hiring away NFL stars and luring some of the college stars like Herschel Walker to sign with their league. But it turned out that the vast majority of football fans preferred the NFL to this new upstart league. They were perfectly happy watching NFL games, and they didn't want another league. And very quickly, the USFL ran into financial problems. The billionaires who were putting money up for it found that it was a huge money pit. They were losing huge amounts of money, and the whole league folded after only 2 seasons. And of course, the reason there, of course, is they didn't really understand the audience. They thought that if they hired stars and put up a league in cities that didn't have NFL teams, that it would be successful. But it turned out that the market was already saturated. Another example is David Letterman, the comedian David Letterman's morning talk show. Letterman had built up a lot of goodwill with NBC executives with his frequent appearances on the Johnny Carson Tonight Show, and they thought he would make a great talk show host in the morning. And so they gave him his own show. But Letterman's snarky sense of humor mainly appealed to college-aged kids. It was college frat boy humor. And, of course, the vast majority of morning audiences was made up of middle-aged housewives whose Letterman's humor completely missed, fell flat. And the morning show bombed from the very beginning. It was got terrible ratings and was canceled after only 4 months. But, of course, later on, Letterman staged a big comeback when they moved him to his rightful position, which is in late night, when college students would be watching, and he had a very successful talk show career later on. But the morning show was notorious for being a huge failure. One of the more significant and tragic failures mentioned in this book is Hurricane Katrina, which was a Category 3 hurricane, so a major hurricane that hit New Orleans and parts of Alabama. But the true disaster was the lack of preparedness and the failure to rescue people after the disaster. Much of the blame lays at the foot of the New Orleans mayor, Ray Nagin, who at first refused to issue a mandatory evacuation. And then when he finally did, he waited too late. Also, there was a bus driver strike going on in New Orleans, and the union refused to call off the strike and provide buses to evacuate people. When buses were finally provided, they refused to allow people to bring their pets with them. And so a lot of people simply stayed in New Orleans because they didn't want to abandon their dogs and cats to the hurricane. And of course, the federal government also completely failed to handle the follow-up to the hurricane because the leader of FEMA was a guy named Michael Brown, who was a political appointment. He had been a big fundraiser for the Bush administration, but he knew absolutely nothing about emergency preparedness and disaster relief, and they completely botched the program. They brought in house trailers, mobile homes for homeless people displaced to live in, but they bought really cheaply made mobile homes that had formaldehyde in them as part of their manufacture, and a lot of the people that moved into the homes became sick. They developed autoimmune disease or severe allergies from the formaldehyde. So it was just a colossal disaster brought on by incompetence, arrogance, and a lack of foresight. And the whole thing, the hurricane itself could not have been prevented, but if it had been handled better, there would have been much fewer loss of life, and the recovery would have been much greater. And of course, it had long-term consequences because a large number of people moved out of New Orleans and resettled in the Houston area, and they're still there all these decades later. On a lighter note, another epic fail was the E.T. video game. E.T. Extraterrestrial was a hugely successful kids movie by Steven Spielberg. At the time, it was the highest grossing movie of all time. But the Atari company paid millions of dollars for the rights to make a video game based on the movie. They wanted the game to come out about the same time the movie did, so they rushed the production very quickly. And crucial mistake they made was they didn't beta test the game. They just assumed that because it was an E.T. video game, it would be a huge seller because the movie was so popular. Well, it turned out to be a terrible video game. The graphics were bad. It was a confusing story. It was full of glitches and bugs in the system because they hadn't beta tested and rushed it through. And crucially, the game was really aimed at older kids, teenagers, and people in their 20s, whereas the movie was primarily a kids' movie. So when little kids bought the game, they were disappointed in the movie, and it turned out to be a huge failure. Atari lost millions of dollars, and there's a story, I don't know if it's true or not, that they dug a big landfill in New Mexico and buried thousands of copies of the video game in this landfill because they couldn't sell them. And it was one of the crucial failures that led ultimately to the demise of the Atari video game system. This is a case where they were so anxious to get the game out in time to coincide with the movie that they failed to take their time and produce a good game. Just slapping the name of a famous movie or a popular movie on a video game doesn't guarantee that the video game will sell. The game has to be able to sell itself. All right, number 6, we have an example of a failure that was really just bad luck, and that is the Minnesota Vikings in their failures to win the Super Bowl. From 1969 through the 1970s, the Minnesota Vikings wound up in the Super Bowl 4 different times. They had a legendary coach, Bud Grant, and a truly legendary quarterback, Fran Tarkington, who played something like 16 seasons without missing a single game, just a phenomenal achievement. And yet, every time they got to the Super Bowl, they lost. Sometimes they were blowouts, sometimes they were close, but they lost every Super Bowl game. Well, they were a good team. They were a great team because they managed to get to the Super Bowl 4 times within a 10-year period. That's a pretty remarkable thing, but they never won. And so that's a case of an epic fail that was more a case of bad luck. They had an off day at the worst possible time. And the final one I want to talk about goes back into the 19th century. Some of these stories go back to the early days of the United States. This one was a little known but rather bizarre episode involving the U.S. Army and the idea of putting camels instead of horses to serve soldiers, cavalry officers in the Old West. Jefferson Davis, who at the time was the Secretary of War for the United States, had this idea of importing camels from the Middle East and using them to replace horses for cavalry officers. And on paper, this may have sounded like a reasonable idea. Camels handle desert heat much better than horses do. They don't need as much water. They can go longer without getting tired. And so he thought, well, this would be a good idea as an experiment. So they set up they sent a bunch of camels and they hired some Arabian camel drivers to go to a fort in Texas and experiment with this idea. Well, it turns out, though, that camels are not easy to ride. It takes special training and to handle them. They're notoriously moody and can be mean-spirited and bite people if they're not happy. And the cavalry officers were just not crazy about having to deal with camels. They were used to horses, and that's what they wanted to ride. Then, of course, the Civil War broke out. Jefferson Davis joined the Confederacy and actually became the president of the Confederacy. The whole camel program was abandoned, and after the war ended, it was never restarted. So that's a combination of it was a good idea in theory, but it didn't work out in practice, and then other events caused it to be disrupted, in this case, the Civil War. And so that's what the book is about. It's about these little stories about all these bad decisions that were made, and some of them, of course, were tragic, some were more comic, but they are usually the result of either impulsive arrogance, poor planning, or just failure to anticipate a certain change. Now, some cases that are not in this book are things like the failure of old-time department stores like Sears, Montgomery Ward, and Kmart, all of which failed because they failed to deal with the changes in consumer culture. Montgomery Ward, for example, was based in cities, downtown parts of cities, and in the 1970s, when people began moving to the suburbs, they failed to follow them. They stayed downtown, and of course, the customers abandoned them. In the case of Sears, they failed to anticipate the switch from catalog shopping to the internet. And of course, Kmart was also a victim of that as well, online. And of course, the competition from upstart box stores like Target and Walmart didn't help. So it's an entertaining book. And there are some lessons to learn. And one of the big lessons is no matter how smart you are, no matter how successful you've been in the past, you can still do a dumb thing. And as he says in the afterwards, we all do dumb things. We all make dumb decisions. We need to accept the fact that we're not always going to be smart. We're not always going to make the right decisions. And if we're lucky, the bad decisions we make will only have limited consequences, and maybe we can learn from them. The book is The United States of Epic Fails. The author is Bill O'Neill. This has been another Man in Great Book Review. Thanks for watching.